Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Hazardous Webinar today that we've put on again on the LA fires. We know that the LA fires is a really topical conversation starter in Australia and about the application of the lessons learnt to fire management and disaster resilience here in Australia. We're also really proud to partner again with AFAC on delivering this webinar, and again shows the strong relationship we've got with AFAC and all the various agencies that make up AFAC, which is fantastic. We are here today to really hear from Dr. Faraz Hedayati and the fantastic work that his team has been leading from the Institute for Insurance, Business and Home Safety from the US. They've been on the ground already in California looking at the outcomes of the fires, and we've got some fantastic research to be able to share with you today. So it's a real pleasure to have Faraz with us. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel that we're going to have later on the webinar very shortly, but before I do, I just want to provide a short acknowledgement of country. I'm here on Wongal country today, on the edge of the beautiful Sydney Harbour, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the elders past, present, and emerging. And I really want to also pay acknowledgement to the fantastic First Nations researchers that we have within our NHRA community. The work too that we'll be leading over the next few months to really start to think about more and more about our First Nations strategy moving forward in terms of our research program for the future as well. So thank you for those that are already involved in that particular piece of work. In terms of some housekeeping, we've got our panel being recorded today, and so there'll be a link available next week to that. So please feel free to share that around your organisation and promote the work that the Centre is doing and today's webinar. We're going to have a Q&A today, Q&A session, so please use the Q&A box tab on the webinar interface to please place your questions. I'll try to get to as many as possible today, and we'll have some really great interaction with our various panelists today as well. If you've got any technical issues throughout the webinar today as well, we've got our NHRA team in the background, so please place any technical issues in the chat, and they will attempt to get to them there as well. I'm going to briefly introduce you to Faraz as well. So Faraz is actually joining us from North Carolina. Faraz is the lead research engineer at the Institute for Business and Home Safety. And Faraz will provide a first look at the findings from recently released studies discussing the LA fires with the context as the latest catastrophic fires globally. And we all saw this on our news here in Australia with the drought conditions, combination of the winds and the devastating fires, which caused, unfortunately, fatalities, but significant losses of property in the LA area. And we do think very much about what lessons can we learn here in Australia. And again, one of the key reasons why we're doing another webinar today, building off the webinar that we did in February earlier on this year as well. We're also really lucky to have some other guests join us today. From NEMA, firstly, we've got our Deputy Coordinator General, Joe Buffone. Joe's well known to many of you, but with various backgrounds in organisations such as the Office of Emergency Service Commissioner in Victoria, Country Fire Authority, and now also into the National Emergency Management Agency there as well. And also Raphaele Blanchi from CSIRO, who's been leading some fantastic work for NHRA, and we'll get a chance to hear a little bit about that work too from Rafi later on today as well. So I'm going to get right into the main event though, and I'm going to ask Faraz, who's just popped up on the screen there, to lead us through the presentation that he's got to share with us today. So thank you, Faraz.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. So yeah, let's just start this. In 2023, my colleagues and I at IBHS, we studied conflagrations, and not necessarily wildfire conflagrations, but anything related to that, in different parts of the world, London, United States, other cities in Europe, and we've been the contributing factors into three categories. And I want to go through each individual category and focus mostly on the ones that we can change. The natural environment is something that we need to accept when it comes to risk, but the other ones are the ones that humans can actually meaningfully alter. So let's start on those and see what was the conditions in the tragedies that we saw in LA. Well, what we had in LA County and Ventura County, the two ones that I highlighted here, in about a month, we got into severe droughts. And this is like a flash drought, and what it does to the surface fuel that exists in that area, like chaparral, is that it quickly dries them out. And when it comes to the wind condition in that area, Santa Ana winds is something that we have in this time of the year. This kind of wind exists in Hawaii, in Colorado, different parts of the world have different names. Chinook is another name that they are famous for. But they share similar characteristics, and that is at lower altitudes or like right off the surface, they have higher velocity. The photo that you see on the right-hand side here is actually a photo from Hawaii, which I'll come back to Hawaii later in the tragedy we had in 2023 in Lahaina, that the flow momentum is much higher at the surface compared to the low-level weak buoyant flow or high-level buoyant flow up here. And the wind speed that was measured in the LA County fires was about 120 kilometers an hour in Palisade and 104 in Eaton fire. At this wind speed, all air suppression just ground, and they cannot operate. So as we can see, in only 14 hours, 70% of the growth of the Palisade fire happened, and in 24 hours, 96% of the Eaton fire. So I went through all the natural environment that was in place for Lahaina. All of them were in the most adverse condition. Now let's move forward and focus on the other category, the built environment. And I want to spend some time on the structure density. So what we did at IBHS to attack this structure density problem, divide and conquer kind of approach, we started by looking at fire spread from a shed to the main building. I have a source building that is burning, you see here, the target building, I'm measuring the heat flux in between on the target building, and these are full-scale experiments. The distance between them is 40 feet here. I changed that. The material on the target building changed, the angle changed, the wind speed, and also the shed type, wood or metal. And you see like one of the experiments at 40 feet that about 25 of my colleagues were involved in each of these experiments. So going through the damage modes very quickly, well, we had no damage in two cases at 40 feet separation. Then you see that this vinyl glazing here melted, and you see like it's dangling around. So this type of window has about 20% market share in the US, has a very dominant presence. So when it comes to vents, we all know that embers can get into the attic through the vents. These vents have some intumescent paint on those. So as they receive heat, they expand. So in order to maintain the right ventilation rate for the attic area, that needs to get removed. And then some pressure washing because we had soot accumulation here. Going to envelope damage, you see this window falling out. This one will shortly do the same thing. And these are tempered glass. We know they are better than annealed glass, and they just fall out. They don't shatter in place. Annealed glass shatters in place. And this is the aftermath. You need a handyman to basically fix this building. The non-combustible siding fiber cement bowed out in 2 experiments. And a more severe damage that I had, the moving sash of the vinyl window actually bowed in. You see there is an opening here. It's not like a wide gap, but it's a more severe because after losing the outer pane, the moving sash was deformed. And then we get into total loss. After using the outer pane, the inner pane is slid down in 2 experiments, and this is wide enough, it's about 5 centimeters for embers and flames to get in, and I put this on their total loss because we lost the envelope of the building, basically. In one of my experiments, the fascia board ignited, and the parts that were not covered by non-combustible gutter, you see that how that ignited. It wasn't a sustained flame, but if I would have let it go, it would convert the building to a pile of ash. Another building, a more intense ignition on the target building, you see that the eave is engulfed in flames at 10 feet separation, and that's why enclosed eaves are very important in dense neighborhoods, because flame can touch the eave area. And in one of my experiments at 20 feet separation, half of the building is combustible, the other half is non-combustible. Upon ignition, 5-6 seconds later, flames are in the attic, and then get through the vents into the attic, basically. Remember I talked about the intumescent paint and how that blocks flame and ember entry? In this case, it did not. And there are several reasons into this. We can get into Q&A that why it didn't happen, but well, it didn't perform the way that I was expecting to. So everything I presented up to now were all the experiments at 25 to 30 miles an hour wind. Sorry for the units. And then I increased the wind speed to 55 miles an hour. And what happens here is part of the flame becomes wind-driven and part become buoyancy-driven. And the stronger the wind is, the shorter the buoyancy-driven zone is. And then at 55 miles an hour, I barely have any buoyancy-driven zone. All the heat that was supposed to go into the atmosphere now is touching the target building and igniting that. We see that we lost some shingles at high wind speed, and this is an interesting failure. This window failed, and then you can see this one is pulsating, and at some point it just pushes the window in. So the hot gas or the convective heat transfer softens the material, the vinyl, and then the wind pressure pushes that in. So getting into the data, I have 4 plots here for you, 10, 20, 30, and 40. And if you go after a critical heat flux threshold, in the literature it's between 7 to 13 kilowatts. We can see all of them exceed that, right? So that is not the right criteria to discriminate between the effects of separation distance onto basically the risk of ignition. The other common criteria that we have in our field is to look at total energy that the target building received. And then you can see that in the case that it led to ignition at 10 feet is lower than the rest of them. So this too is not the criteria to look at when it comes to discriminating the risk. And the reason for this is that it happens at a shorter time. So the building ignites, there is no energy to receive after that, right? So we have a shorter time, so less amount of energy. But if we look at energy input in 10, 20, 30 seconds, and I don't want to get into the details of this, just the reason I'm going after tens of seconds is that it's the response time of building materials. If we're looking at pine needles, that's in the order of second, building materials in the orders of tens of seconds. We start seeing a very interesting pattern. We see that basically among all the possible outcomes, when I have no damage, all the events are here in this range, right? When I have some damage, the distribution changes. There is a meaningful shift to the right. Similarly, when I get to loss, this shift continues to move forward. So imagine I have this threshold here. I'm well into the orange distribution, this one here, and start to touch the loss distribution. So in a probabilistic way, I can look at it and say, what is the different possibilities or likelihood of damage modes? But the takeaway from this is, if the energy input is above this threshold, I get into damage, and if it's above this threshold, I get into loss. So at 10 feet separation, we see the background photo, direct flame contact, and the gray histograms in the background is basically the energy input. All of them are above the critical threshold. So I'm 100% into this distribution. Going back to 20 feet, from 100%, I go down to 34%. Now I have a way to discriminate the possibility or the likelihood of having total loss as the distance increases. Going further back, there is no flame contact, and it's mostly radiation and convective heat transfer, and it gets down to 1%. And at 40 feet, you can see the background here. There is not even flame is not even close to the target building. and all of those energy packets are below the lower threshold. So if I have no chance of any damage on the target building. And this is the takeaway. With the conditions that I have here, I'm not going to go through this list here, but these are the limitations of this framework, basically what I tested. We can see that as the distance increases, what is the likelihood of structure-to-structure fire spread or configurations? I didn't talk about high wind speed and the impacts of 55 miles an hour wind on the outcome. Well, regardless of the distance, 96% into the distribution and into the loss distribution. And this is actually what happened in Lahaina, what happened in the LA County fires. The wind speed pushed all that heat that was supposed to go up to the buildings downwind, and then that led to overwhelming the building material. Anything that was in the typical building materials all got overwhelmed, and we see that tragedy. We saw that tragedy. So after this shed experiment, I scaled up to ADUs. So similar approach, but instead of a burning shed, now I have a burning auxiliary dwelling unit or ADUs. So as you're looking at this video, one of them is wood, one of them is fiber cement, and one of them is stucco. And we see that regardless of the siding, the way that these buildings fail is the same. Doors and windows fail way before the siding plays a role. There are ways to quantify it, which we can talk about it offline. But the point of least resistance is a very important topic, and it is very important to look at the building as a system, not individual components. Well, while the siding didn't play a role in reducing the vulnerability of this building specifically, it does play a role in slowing down the fire spread in the community. So you can see after 40 minutes, this is a stucco building and this is a wood building. Because the structure stays in place for a stucco, it traps a lot of the heat behind it, basically. And we see that none of those energy packets that were hitting the target building is in loss zone. But when we have wood, we clearly see a difference. So this is very important that if we use stucco or this kind of material, we can slow down the progress of fire in a community. So going back to LA, this is in Palisade, and I talked about at 40 feet separation, there is zero chance of any loss, any damage. This shows that this building is 60 feet apart from this, and the wind speed is from right to left here, like that. So all of the heat that this building released was hitting to 221. And because the window was extremely vulnerable, one pane, anneal glass with wood frame. Well, we did see some damage, and this is my point of we can't just stretch the experimental result into the field without knowing all these details. If this window was the same as what I tested at IBHS, we would probably see a similar result to the test that I ran at IBHS. So everything I talked about is the worst case condition, downwind heating. So this is the same building that I just talked about, 221. So the window was here, and downwind heating is basically 224, pushes all the heat to 221. But we also have crosswind condition. So as this building ignited, because of the connective fuel here between this building down here to this, it carried all the flame here in crosswind condition and heated the heat. This was suppressed by first responders, otherwise would be a different story to this building. So in crosswind condition and downwind condition, the risk is quite different. So in this case, both of the neighbors ignited or destroyed, and this building received a lot of heat from burning all of these neighbors around, this guy, this guy, this guy. Because there is no connective fuel here, this is a driveway, there was no damage here. And on the other side, remember I talked about the stucco and how can trap the heat to compartmentalize the fire? This fence did the same. So the neighbor here was all consumed, the structure is consumed, but all the heat stayed on this side and didn't cause any damage on this one. So on the day of the fire, there was trash day. So a lot of trash cans were out, and that played a big role in acting as connective fuel and caused a lot of damage on buildings. We had several examples like this. Hot tubs, another one that is probably not very common to think about. We saw examples of that. So this hot tub was ignited by embers, and because of its ignition, we have some serious damage on all the openings on this building. 0 to 5 foot. This is a very interesting case. We talked about 0 to 5 foot around buildings should be non-combustible because that's where embers accumulate. So in this case, embers accumulated here, and then this is like mulch, and it ignited those, and the wind pushed the hot gas in through this pipe. You can see this is discolored, and then pushed that into the garage. This was suppressed by first responders, but this highlights the importance of not having any combustible in the 0 to 5 foot around buildings. This is an example from the right-hand side, the green area here is Altadena Golf Course. And then I'm standing here taking photo. You see that embers flew over the golf field, basically, and ignited this, all the combustibles here. But because there is no combustible touching the building, there is no damage. On the back side of this building, this neighbor ignited, and because of this awning acting as a connective fuel, carried the fire over, and you can see the fascia board here is damaged, and the window is also damaged. So without having this connective fuel in crosswind condition, we can stop the chain of conflagration. 6-inch vertical clearance. So we saw examples of embers accumulating at the base of combustible walls, combustible decks, igniting that. All of these 3 cases are suppressed by first responders. And window panes, we talked about windows in the lab, basically, but having anneal glass is vulnerable. And if they were tempered glass here, there would be no damage on this building. I want to conclude my talk by taking you to Hawaii. So 6 weeks after the fire, IBHS deployed a team, 6 of us went to Hawaii, and we looked at the tragedy that took place in Lahaina. Early in the morning, a brush fire was reported in the highlighted area, which was immediately suppressed by first responders. Then the fire was rekindled closer to the built environment, where you see that the Lahaina bypass. And in that area, the grassland was touching the built environment. Grass fires do not produce embers. The embers burn out as they fly. But when they touch the buildings, they can ignite those, and then the fire becomes ember-driven. And all the embers from the burning structures in this area flew about a mile, 1.5 kilometers, landed on combustible siding or roof on the front street, ignited that, and the chain of conflagration started, multiple fire fronts in the community. Later in the afternoon, embers ignited homes in the highlighted area. When I was in Hawaii, I ran to a firefighter, off-duty firefighter, who decided to stay behind and save homes. He ran into dry hydrants, and he did the next best thing, which was jumping on his bike and documenting the fire. And so credit where it's due, Dan Nelson shared all of this footage with me. So as you can see, this is not an ember-driven fire. We have a few spot fires around, but the main source of flame in this neighborhood is that burning car that I highlighted here. When you're looking at the video, you can see there is a burning shed in the background. And when you look at this closer, this is the burning car. All of these fuels here is green. The shed is still here, the trees are green, but this is the burning shed in the background. And this is 3 months before the fire. So the shed ignited, connective fuel, tree acted as a connective fuel, ignited this home, and their fire came down to this building. With these the few buildings here burning, embers and flames from them contributed into pushing the fire downwind, and the chain of conflagration started in this neighborhood. So now he's standing in Kahama Street here, you're looking at all of these homes burning. And then the chain of conflagration keeps moving on, fire gets to the end of this cul-de-sac, now he's standing in this street access road behind, and you're looking at all these neighbors are burning. So when these homes were burning, the fire became ember-driven. And then the security footage from his home shows that how heavy the ember attack was at the time. But this building, despite of being bombarded by all of these embers, thousands per second, all the building materials did their job. The building survived because it has non-combustible roof, 6-inch clearance at the base of the wall, and maintained defensible space around it. The reason that this building failed was that connective fuel, the fence, was touching the window here. And then you could actually hear in the video that the windows crack and then flames get into the building, basically. And look at this, it's literally a war zone. The chain of conflagration keeps moving on. And because of this connective fuel here, again, after this building burned, passed the torch, pun intended, to this building and ignited that as well. And the chain of conflagration only stopped in this area when there is no connective fuel between the two buildings. So without having connective fuel in cross condition, we can break the chain of conflagration. And you can see this building started off-gassing. The siding is blistering, the fascia board is smoking, basically, but it didn't ignite. And the chain of conflagration stopped here, and that led to having multiple buildings down here survive. And this is the important parameters in the Lahaina tragedy that we have. The structure density was the driving factor of risk, which impacts connective fuel. We have more vehicles, we have more sheds, we have more fences when we have high density neighborhoods. And then eventually we get to building materials. This is a slippery slope. This doesn't mean that building materials don't matter. What it means is that when the exposure, the heat exposure is so high that structure density and connective fuel play a role in that, they can overwhelm building material. And in order to get the benefit from building materials, we need to reduce exposure by spacing out buildings in new developments. In existing developments, we need to remove connective fuel to give a fighting chance to building material. And thanks for listening.
Faraz, thank you very much for your presentation to us this morning. I think everybody's taken a lot out of that, particularly aspects around urban vulnerability and urban fire spread and urban risk, which we're obviously very focused on here in Australia. Joe and Rafi put their cameras on, so welcome them now. We'll start to form the panel. I do see some folks that have put some questions in the chat. We'll get to them very soon. I would encourage everybody else to either vote for your favorite question that's there already, or to pose another question to the panel. So I'm going to firstly start with Rafi and Joe, and then come back to Faraz. But Rafi, you're doing some work with NHRA on similar topics, particularly around buildings and human behavior around buildings and building resilience as well, just as a general theme and topic. What are some of the things that you take out of what Faraz has just presented in comparison to the work in Australia, particularly around the risks of urban conflagrations here in Australia as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you as well, Faraz. That was really interesting to see some of the evidence that you find in those surveys as well. Because we also found a lot of similarity in Australia when we look at post-bushfire survey and try to understand how the fire has impacted an urban interface and how it has spread within this interface. And I can see that there is, potentially, possibility to happen as well in Australia in some region and under certain conditions as well. And the condition that you, mentioned were, having a long period of drought, high temperature, and we have also strong wind events. And under those conditions, we can have large-scale fire that can spread very quickly in the landscape and are really hard to stop and can overwhelm fire services. On the other side, what we can have when those fires reach the urban interface as well, and if we have a high density housing, like you mentioned, and a lot of combustible elements, within this interface that can spread the fire rapidly. And we have those one as well, what you call connective fuel as well. And then we seen them in many post-bushfire survey, how they can ignite the house as well. If I think about one of the experience we have in Australia where we came very close to urban conflagration, I would talk about the Canberra fire that happened in 2003, where after this event happened after we have a very long period of drought that make everything in the landscape very dry. Not only the vegetation, but also the building elements and everything's around that. We also have very strong winds. with up to gusts to 100 km/h that would damage the building before the fire arriving and during the fire arriving. And on top of that, an burst storm as well. So that's a perfect mix between lots of ignitions and very dry components as well. And we observe for this fire like structural loss up to 700 meters within the interface as well. So if we take a bit of perspective back, like those houses were not built to regulation at the time of the fire, and now we have building regulation that's, support some of the reduce the combustibility of the structure, but those regulation does not take into consideration some of the aspect of urban conflagration, like house to house fire spread. And they also only apply to 100 meters of the urban interface, which is okay for normal fire, which take into consideration 80% of the loss. But when we have those events, how we can protect those houses further into the interface.
Thanks, Rafi. Really good insights there from an Australian context. I want to head to Joe now. And so, Joe, you've just heard Rafi and Faraz. What do you take that out in terms of issues for Australia? And, from a practitioner's perspective and not only from NEMA, but, the broader fire community as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Morning, everyone. And thank you, Faraz and Raphaele. I think there's a couple of things that I think we should look at. One of the first ones that Faraz spoke about is looking at the building as a system rather than, in the individual parts. And I actually think that we should be looking at the whole environment as a system. When you saw some of the three elements that Faraz spoke about, you start with the weather, then you look at the actual natural environment in terms of the bush, the terrain, and then moves into the urban environment, and then you end up with the conflagration, of the buildings. If we start with, and the other thing is that stuck to me was the building structure. And we've got, as we know, we've got Bell standards in Australia. But if they're not maintained, then very quickly you see the degradation of the structure. But I believe we should look at an end-to-end system approach, starting with preparedness, starting with the people element of it. But then the other big thing is in the bush as well. There's a lot of strategies that we actually use quite successfully. And post Black Saturday, I actually reflected on that in Victoria, township protection plans were actually developed that did look at a system, a full system approach. What can you do in the bush? What can you do on ridge tops that will actually stop, the fire sort of building up that energy? Strategic fire breaks. And then at each point, we actually have a look at that. A big one, Andrew, that I think is worthy of a lengthier discussion are the urban strategies for fighting structure fire. And you heard Faraz talking about 40 foot or 12 meters in Australian language. So what does that mean in terms of current SOPs, current strategies for urban firefighting when you end up in a model like that? So that end-to-end systems approach, I think, can be done. The good thing, the positive thing is we've got the data, we've got the systems, we've got successful strategies. Just recently in Victoria around Halls Gap, some of those strategies were actually used in the bush that then protected the urban environment or the peri-urban environment. Thanks, Andrew. Back to you.
Thank you, Joe. And so I'm going to go to our first question from our audience, and it relates to what you're just talking about there too, Joe. Like, I think a number of us lived through the changes that were brought in after the Royal Commission, after the Black Saturday bushfires. One of the big things was obviously the previous stay and defend policy and the move towards much more proactive measures around evacuation. And one of the things that I've observed, particularly out of the LA fires, is conversations about why were the death tolls so low. But we've got a question here from Michael, who's really asking about the role of first responders as being key to offsetting some of these vulnerabilities that Faraz has highlighted. And a question firstly to Faraz, and then the others potentially to jump in on as well, is were there examples of homeowners staying and defending, or private agencies or fire departments being able to reduce the vulnerabilities in the LA context and the efficacy of those? So if you're able to sort of share if you came across any of those in your initial research, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we saw numerous examples of suppressed fires. Basically, when we see water splash on a siding or like small, like just charred area, that's or like footprints. That's always an example of suppression. I'm not sure if that was like homeowners staying behind to do that or first responders stepping in. In the US, I know in Australia, that's a different strategy. In the US, we don't recommend homeowners to stay back, they just evacuate. And but regardless, yeah, we saw a lot of examples of first responders suppressing fires.
So just a quick follow-up question there for us, because I'm sure it'll be on the tip of the tongue of many online as well. Was there any insights there about different types of buildings or structures in the suppression efficacy, or perhaps too nuanced at this point in time?
I don't think I saw examples of that.
Okay, all good. Rafi, one of the things that you're looking at in your research is the impact of human behavior, right, in terms of the resilience of buildings. Anything that you think in terms of the LA experience that's connects to that question?
Just first of all, maybe to also touch on this aspect of people that help in extinguishing the fire. In our previous research, like looking at a different large-scale fire, we find out that there is a 3 to 6 times more chance to a house to survive when people are present to suppress those ignition. And people can be like residents or neighbor, but also can be firefighters and first responders as well. So that really makes a difference in terms of house survivability as well. In terms of, or like looking a bit more at some of the resilience of people and maybe some of the research that we're doing at the moment, and working more myself on building and urban design as well, which encompass anything from building and planning regulation, but also best practice, how we can go beyond regulations, community perceptions, community awareness, and education as well. I have to say it's important to consider that as a socio-technical questions. Like we can come up with extremely good technical or engineer solutions that can prevent, the fire to ignite something or also to suppress the fire. But we need to see how we engage with, the residents and the community to see how they can adopt those measures, how they can, are they affordable for them as well, how they can maintain, like Joe touched on that as well, like, how we can maintain the efficacy of a building the way it was built as well. So it's very important to consider those two aspects, the physical and the social, all together when we're thinking about preventing the risk of fire on the built environment.
Great, thanks, Rafi. And Joe, a lot of what Faraz and Rafi have just come to really goes to the whole point about the primacy of life and some of the changes that were brought in after the Black Saturday events. Did you have anything that you wanted to touch on there?
Yeah, Andrew, I think, as you know, Black Saturday changed the strategy of, stay and defend. But I think the stay and defend was very much based on the catastrophic or mega fire, as Bernie Teague actually described the fires at. And, we then actually acknowledge that once you get to 4,000 kilowatts of energy, at the head of a fire, and then that sort of starts to, increase rapidly, that's when you can't defend. But when you look at some of the examples that have been given here, but also many examples in Australia, if you're like 3, 4 streets in, 5 streets in, and you're not in that direct line, of the fire front, that there is a potential for houses to be protected. And there were some examples that I saw on some of the both social media and also news events where homeowners in LA did stay, they didn't evacuate, and they did suppress the fires. The other thing, Andrew, our current peri-urban model is if you're to evacuate, you don't evacuate the whole area, you evacuate 2 streets in. So you move 2 streets in. But the question that was asked around the role of first responders, I think it is something that is really, really important. We put a lot on what we want from first responders. The first one is to communicate from the human element with those that are still there. So that's the first thing. The second one is the technical response to the fire, actually dealing with the hazard. So what are we doing from the bush perspective, but also what are we doing in the urban environment? And Andrew, out of all the things, I think that that's one area that we should be exploring around the strategies and tactics of urban firefighting in this scenario. And if I could just add one other thing, because Faraz prompted something that I don't think that we do in terms of early information. When we've got like cyclones or severe weather, some of our warnings is about moving, rubbish tins, loose items, some of those sorts of things away. One of the things I picked up from what Faraz just spoke about, like trash cans, wheelie bins that are generally pushed up against the house, gas cylinders that are, and that happened in Black Saturday, gas cylinders venting. But one of the things I think we should pick up from this is actually warnings that when you're preparing your home, one, move away the mulch, ideally not have it there, but from, touching the building, look at some of those, some of those things that can continue the flame fire, but even things like wheelie bins that could be combustible that just add to it. I think that's a really easy one. But the role of first responders becomes critical in not only dealing with the direct attack of the fire, but how you organize community to actually respond as a collective.
Great, thanks, Joe. I'm now going to go through some quick fire questions specifically for Faraz that are in the chat relating to US practice or US related research there. Okay, so the first one is about the lateral movement of heat. And so the question there from Kyle is, did this movement of heat laterally also reduce the efficacy of preemptive defenses, for example, sprinkler systems, green barriers through evaporation, etc.?
It definitely affects the efficacy of external sprinklers. At the 80 miles an hour wind speed, water droplets do not land when they are supposed to. They just are blown away. And my Australian colleagues are actually leading this research field around the globe, and I'm learning based on their research. I would say from the heat transfer perspective, because the wind temperature is always lower than the flame temperature, it will always dilute the flame and reduce the temperature on the building material. But when we are talking about very compact environment, the distance between the two buildings becomes a reaction zone. So all those combustible material in that area starts pyrolysis and releasing heat, and all the heat stays in that area. So that's a long way to say that I don't think at this wind speed, external sprinklers can go a long way to reduce the vulnerability. In California specifically, we do have water issue problems because the hydrants are designed to address 3 or 4 homes. When you're talking about a whole community burning, drawing water from that water line basically would impact first responders, and that's the last thing we want to do.
Okay, next one here relates to and I've seen this on the PBS video that is in the chat there as well. And your really good high definition camera experiments that you do in your lab at North Carolina really show where the embers fall once they hit the building, right? And right at the base of the building and then ignite the building. But the question says, California policy is for householders to create a fuel-free zone for the first 5 feet, 1.5 meters from the house facade. So the person asking the question is asking for your opinion about, will the distance be now reviewed, or should it be reviewed from your opinion?
Well, it really depends. So the 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone around homes is designed to address flame embers vulnerability. When embers, because that becomes the stagnation point of the flow, which is typically half of the height of the building. So say the building is 10 feet tall, then 5 foot is the area that embers can accumulate or stagnate in that area. So it is becoming a law in California, but the enforcement is always a question that what are the resources and how they want to enforce this. That's a separate topic. But from the heat transfer and resiliency perspective, that is becoming a law in California.
And we also had a question here about the video about the windows that you showed there, and Joe's alluded to the systems approach there as well. And so was there any evidence of the curtains catching alight before the failure of the windows?
A good question. I saw one example of plastic or vinyl curtains deformed from, I was standing outside. I actually paid a lot of attention with my binocular looking at it. I couldn't see any charring or anything on that. It was just deformed. And that was just one example.
Thanks, Faraz. I'm going to get a Rafi now. There's a question in the chat here about land use planning as well. So, and the question, Rafi and Joe, feel free to jump into on this one. It's about the density. And so why in Australia in high-risk bushfire areas do we still allow relatively high densities in the way that Faraz is talking about, which might allow for this this type of urban spread?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question as well. I think at the moment, like the regulations work in a way that there is a building regulations that is quite effective to, looking at the combustibility of exterior elements of a building itself. There is also the planning regulation that varies across different jurisdictions that look more at vegetation management and defensible space. But there is not a regulation that takes into consideration, for example, house-to-house fire spread across boundaries as well, and what's the density of the housings that we need to have to reduce those house-to-house fire spread. And the regulation does not take into consideration as well those combustible elements like around the house, the fixed one, like sheds and carports and things like that, but also the mobile one that Joe mentioned just before, like where you park your car, the wood heap, and all this sort of stuff. So that are not also considered in Australia. How we design fences, what type of ground cover we put around the building as well. So that limits really those limitations are something that we good to see taking into considerations as well. Like it could be expected to be taken into consideration by the regulation, but also could be expected to be dealt by some of the residents and the community as well. But at the moment, there is no specific density that has been defined where we have reduced the house-to-house fire spread. This is mainly this question of distance between house-to-house that Faraz mentioned, the 40 feet and the 12 meters here that we have, and that we've seen as well, this 12 meters in some of the post-bushfire survey.
And just on that, Rafi, so one of the questions in the chat there too is, what can we learn from our Black Summer events? And I know that you've done some work through the work that through CSIRO and also through the work that you're doing with us as well to understand building vulnerability based upon damage data from those events. Is there any specific insights that you can share from the 2019-25 season?
Not specifically from the 2019-20, but I'm maybe just going to go a little bit before from some other research that we've done. Something that I haven't mentioned, but I'd like to mention as well, like we were talking about first about house-to-house fire spread. We talk about this combustible element, but also how we manage the wind damage. We mentioned at the beginning, during those events, there is very strong wind, and the current building regulations address wind loads that can prevent, a structure to collapse. But the wind damage, that will weaken the extent of the house is not considered in the regulations. So, the minor damage or the small damage, like the tiles that's been lifted, the hole in the facades, the window that's been cracked as well, and that's really increased the vulnerability of the house to the any fire attack like embers and other attack. And that can happen around 75 kilometers per hour type of wind as well.
Great, thanks, Rafi. Now, Joe, earlier on in our panel discussion, you did briefly mention the role of strategic fuel management as well. And Neil Cooper, who's familiar to many of the folk on the call, has got the question around prescribed burning is essential for broad-scale preparedness, but how can we make the art of prescribed burning more accepted to the public, politicians and environmentalists? How can we help the operational practitioners to actually deliver burning programs? So, Joe, your views on that?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Coops, for the question. Look, I think there's a number of factors there back into the social elements of it, and some of this is back to perception of risk. If the community of where you're burning, and talking about using burning as one of the prescribed fuel management techniques, I think that they need to understand really why and what the benefits are. So when there's a lot of smoke around and it's impacting on their ambience for that short period of time, they understand the value of those burns. And the recent fires in particular, both in Victoria and South Australia, demonstrated that good strategic burns, and not necessarily broad acreage, but mosaic style burning, can really make a difference. And it goes back, Andrew, to my commentary around treating ridge tops, for example, so that when the fire sort of picks up speed and runs off the top, and then doesn't launch sort of massive ember attacks on whether it be peri-urban areas or further into the bush. But I do think that it's a mix. So, quite often we go, obviously burning is a very, very valuable thing for a whole host of reasons, not just from fuel reduction, but for ecological reasons as well. But, mechanical strategic fire breaks have demonstrated that they can be very, very successful. And just picking up on Raphael's comments around density, the other thing is, and Faraz spoke about it, the use of fencing. I've personally seen fires pulled up just with a corrugated iron fence, basically, that the fire has ran up to it, and you haven't had the heat, and the continuation onto whether it be buildings, etc. So again, I go back to the end-to-end systems approach, going all the way from where the threat comes from, the terrain, the techniques that are used in there, the strategic burns, the strategic fire breaks, and then all the way to even some very simple and affordable techniques. If you are on a peri-urban area, then maybe the fence should be, either concrete or color bond or something like that, because it'll make a big difference.
Great, thanks, Joe. I'm going to go back to Faraz now with a couple more technical questions based upon your Lahaina and LA research. These relate to our energy transition, so things that we're finding more and more in our urban environment. Did you find anything to do with electric vehicles and batteries in your research?
In Lahaina, besides a lot of vehicles acting as connected fuel, there were a few Prius, which was like hybrid. I didn't see any electric cars there that was just like Teslas. But regardless of that, all of them can act as connected fuel. And the question for electric cars is that we actually don't know how they burn and how long they burn compared to gas cars, basically. But they did play a big role in Lahaina because as people were evacuating, they just parked their car and jumped into one because of the traffic. So there were a lot of stalled vehicles in the street acting as connected fuel to basically let the fire spread at a faster rate.
Right, and the other one about solar panels, the flammability resilience of solar panels.
In Lahaina, we actually had that question in the basically survey, and we didn't find any statistical significance for that. So I would say no, with the caveat that in Lahaina, we don't have a lot of trees that shed debris. So debris can accumulate under the solar panels, and that would be a good recipient fuel for embers to ignite. So because we didn't have a lot of a lot of trees to shed debris, we didn't see any statistical significance in Lahaina.
And now I've got a question in the chat too about best practice guidance on designing and retrofitting buildings for fire resistance. And so I'm going to direct this one to both Faraz and to Rafi. And Faraz, I know that the Institute of Business Home Safety, I think it's the 3 key points that you guys communicate about how homes could be retrofitted into the future for wildfire in the US. Do you want to share those? And then I'll ask Rafi a similar question for here in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my opinion, it needs to be a performance design approach. So if the structure separation or housing density in a community is within a range, some level of mitigation strategies need to go in place. And if it's like the separation distance is larger, we are mostly talking about embers. So in wildfire prepared home program, which I encourage our audience to go on our website and look at the criteria. We actually developed a program that looks at embers, at the vulnerability to embers and flames in two separate bins. And to Joe's point, this is a system. We can't cherry pick from this. We can't say just use the vent or just harden your window. All embers, all vulnerabilities to embers and all vulnerabilities to flame need to be addressed at the same time.
And Rafi, from an Australian perspective, you know, if there was 2 or 3 key things that you thought from your research for Australian buildings to build, retrofit, etc.
Yes, if we're talking about new building, like it's effectively thinking about the siting, you know, how far as possible from vegetations and, you know, design of other combustible elements within close by of the building. But if we think about retrofitting, I think it's where we need to think about every context is going to be different for every people, and we can have a solution that fits everybody. But having this understanding on how the fire might reach your property and what are the key elements you can do, for what you can do in this aspect. Like embers is one aspect, because it could be easy to retrofit for amber depending on your situations. The other aspect is to looking at other combustible elements, the one that are movable that you can take off around your building, and the one that are fixed that you can change as well. That could be also quite cheap as well to do. And go back to the fence aspect is a really good one that a resident can do as well, because they can protect on from the radiant heat from the fire, but only also against other elements like a house burning on the other side of the fence.
Great, thanks, Rafi. I do also see a couple of questions in the chat about the influence of gardens and landscaping around homes. We've got a project on that being led by University of Tasmania, David Bowman, and certainly go to our website to find out a little bit more about that. With just a couple of minutes left, I'm going to throw to each one of our panelists for a quick 10-second final reflection. So the key thing that I want our panelists to basically say is what's the one key thing in Australia, and for us it could be about rebuilding LA in the US context, for example, that we should be taking out of today's webinar.
Andrew, I think I've already covered it, sorry, I'm going to sneak in 2. One is the systems approach, so the end-to-end system, so that you can't separate, you know, the bush from the peri-urban environment, from the actual building and from the human element. And then the last one, I think, which is more of the response thing, is the shift in approach to urban firefighting for this type of scenario. And I think that, you know, we need, you know, we've got great capability. It's just a shift in practice, SOPs and operational model. Thanks.
Great. And Rafi?
Just a few things as well. I think for me, there is a lot of information existing outside about how to make house and garden more resilient to bushfire, but how we translate this information to residents and to communities so they can be empowered to make, you know, informed decision when they're building or when they're retrofitting as well. So that's one of the projects that we have with NHR, with Melbourne Uni and Hedyati and Country Fire Authority as well, to try to better understand the role of residents.
Great, thanks, Rafi. And I'll give our special guest speaker, Faraz, the last word here.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that even under these extreme fire conditions, we are not powerless. We will definitely see homes here burning, a few homes sporadically burning, but there is no reason for us to see communities wipe out. And I think with using the right mitigation strategies, we can bend down the risk here.
A really good end closing statement for us all to have some optimism and some good strategic foresight around the future threat here in our country as well. So I'd like to thank you all of our panelists, Rafi, Joe, and Faraz, but particularly Faraz for joining us in your evening over there in the US, and for providing a really great, insightful presentation today. That is fantastic. So just a couple other thank yous too before, and just some housekeeping before I do finish up and let everybody go. Thanks again to AFAC for partnering on this webinar. Again, great to see. We're going to have another webinar in a couple of weeks' time on the 29th of April. Again, it has a bushfire component. It's about how PowerLink in Queensland, working with NHRA researchers, have been working around the identification of high-risk locations for ignitions across the transmission network there in Queensland. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available online next week, so please feel free to share it amongst your networks. We also have our Natural Hazards Research Forum coming up in June this year, 18th to the 20th of June. I'm pretty confident we'll sell out, so if you want to come along, make sure you get online as soon as you can to register. It'll be a fantastic event, and we have now put the full program up if you're interested in finding out some more detail there. And as I say to everybody that joins any one of our webinars or any events of ours, the best way to keep in touch with what the Centre is doing is to hop on our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll get all the various updates. So just to finally say thank you very much to our panelists and our guest speaker today, but most importantly, thanks to you all online today for joining us. Thank you for your questions. We've tried to get through as many of them as possible, and we look forward to seeing you again online or in person. Thank you very much.